In this video, we're going to talk about server actions, which is a new way to mutate data on your server. Now, at the time of this recording, which is June 2023, server actions are still in alpha release. I'm going to update this video if NextJs releases any major updates on server actions, but we're going to learn this anyways. I've condensed everything that we're going to go over in a little note here, so I remember everything that I want to talk about. So let's get started. Now, let's first define what server actions are. As I mentioned, they're in alpha release and they're built on top of React actions. I'm going to explain what React actions are in a second, but before we get there, server actions are used to do server-side data mutation. So when you want to update your data on the server side, that's called the mutation. We can use server actions. Now, they're going to reduce client-side JavaScript and progressively enhance your forms. Now, if you're using server actions with a server component, they do not require any client-side JavaScript, for example, to submit your forms to your backend and mutate your data. And progressively enhance your forms, it's kind of the same thing, which your forms are going to actually work. They will be interactive. People can submit data without JavaScript, and then React is going to actually enhance it on the client side progressively without blocking the interactivity of your form when you're using server actions. Now, actions in React are experimental feature again, and basically they would allow you to run asynchronous code in response to a user interaction. So a user interaction can be submitting a form. In response to that event, you can run an asynchronous code. Now, actions are defined through the action prop of an element. We're going to see more ways to actually create and invoke actions other than the action prop itself, but this is the most prominent use of your actions. Now, instead of passing a URL to your HTML form, this is how the action prop or attribute works on an HTML form. React allows you to pass in a function to that same action attribute. Now, with using actions, you can also have optimistic updates or optimistic UI, whereby you would just show the update that's intended to be triggered by your server action without waiting for the response of your server action. So that's optimistic UI. So you do the update immediately before waiting for the action to actually finish updating that in your backend. Now let's look at how we actually create server actions. To start, you have to turn this experimental flag for server actions inside of your next config.js, because as I mentioned, this is still an experimental feature in React and also in NextJS. It's in alpha release, so you have to set the experimental flag for it first. And once you've done that, you can define server actions in two different ways. One is inside of a server component that actually uses that server action, or you can define your server actions in a separate file, for example, in actions.js. So therefore, you can reuse the actions that you've defined there in different components. Now, let's look at an example of using server actions with a server component. Now, inside of this example server component that I have add to cart over here, we have defined this asynchronous function. Now, actions are asynchronous functions that you would pass into the action prop of a form. We're going to see different ways that you can actually invoke actions. But for now, the simplest way is to use the action prop of a form element. I hope you can see this. Let me just make this a bit bigger. So the first way is to just pass your actions to the action prop of a form. Now, this is an asynchronous function. It receives the form data. It uses this use server directive in the body of the function. This instructs NextJS that this function is meant to only run on the server. And we're going to follow the similar path if you're using a separate file as well. We're going to see it in a second. And then here in this example, we are reading the cookies because you can also access the cookies inside your server component. And we're getting some data and saving it to our database as an example. Now, this function, just so you know, the arguments that you pass to this server action, and if you are returning anything from it, needs to be serializable, because you're actually submitting this data from the client to the server. So it's crossing the boundary between the server and client. It needs to travel over the network. It needs to be convertible to string. The arguments you pass to it, also anything that you return from your server actions. Now let's look at an example of using server actions with a client component. Now, you cannot define server actions inside client components. You can only import them to client components. So for this example, we're using a separate file. For example, this underscore action.js inside of our app directory. We're going to put this use server directive up top. And once you do this, any other function that you're exporting from this file is going to be treated as a server action. So you don't have to repeat this inside the function body. You can just put it once up top, and it will be applied to every single function that you export from this actions files. And the idea is you would define all of your actions in just one file, and then you can access them or reuse them throughout your application. Now, this underscore naming convention in Next.js, just so you know, makes this private, and it just takes it or opts it out of your route segments. So we have defined this same add item function or server action over here. We then imported it inside of our client component. So this client component lives inside of our component. It's using the use client directive up top to instruct Next.js that this is a client component. And we are importing this because that's the only way you can get server actions inside of your client components. Though you can pass them as props too, we're going to get there. But the point is you cannot define server actions inside client components. You can just import them. And we're just importing that and passing it to the action prop of our form over here. So this is using it in a server component and also in a client component. Now, a note here that I have that even though importing server actions is a recommended way, sometimes you would need to, or you may want to use contextual data like this ID inside of your server action. As you can see here, I'm defining this server action inside of my server component. So I have this example server component. And by the way, these examples are directly from the docs. I've just condensed what I've learned from the docs over here. So I don't take any credit for this. Is actually an example from the documentation. Definitely recommend to check it out. Kudos to the team for putting so much effort into creating the nice documentation here. Now, as you can see here, we are defining this server action, and then inside of it, I'm accessing this ID, which is passed to the server component. And then I'm passing this update item, which is this server action, as a prop to my client component. Now, inside of my client component, I'm receiving this function, which is a server action, and I'm using it to pass it to a client-side action. And this is another pattern that you can use. Now, actions are basically asynchronous functions. You can have client actions or you can have server actions. Server actions are functions that run on the server, but they can be called from the client side. Client actions, as you can see here, are asynchronous functions. So I'm passing in a client action to this form action, and inside of that client action, I'm actually calling this update item, which was a server action that was passed as a prop to my client component, which was created inside of my server components. So you might think I just said you cannot create server actions inside client components. Remember, this is not a server action because it does not use this use server. That's how you would say this is a server action if it has this use server directive inside the function body, or if it is defined in a separate file, like the example we just see here. We have this use server directive up top of the file, which affects all the functions that are exported from here. So here down, we only have a regular client side action, which is not a server action. So we can define it inside of a client component just like that. And inside of it, we're calling this server action that was passed into this client component as a prop. And we created that server action inside of our server component. Now, in the next section, we're going to talk about how do you actually invoke this created server actions. The first example that we've seen was the action prop on a form element. Now, the second way that you could invoke your actions is the form action prop, that you can actually use them on a button, on an input with type submit, or with an input of type image. Now, if you don't know what input type image is, I didn't know either. I looked it up. It's just like an input type submit, or it's just like a button, but instead of a text, it just shows an image on the button. I never came across this, but good to know that you can actually use form actions on these things. And this is when, or it's useful when you want to actually have different actions inside of a form. So if I kind of quickly show here inside of this form, you can see I have a main action, which is this handle submit. This is my main action. And then I have a secondary action, let's say an upvote button, for lack of a better example. And this form action actually takes precedence over this form action. So it takes precedence over the owner of this button. and just submits or invokes this upvote action. So you can have two different actions happening on the same form. Now you can have, let's say, a like button or an upvote, downvote button, or a delete button here tied into a specific server action, and then you can still have your main action for the form when the form is actually submitted. So that was the second way we could invoke server actions. And the third way is actually using start transition. Now, start transition is a function you get back from the use transition hook, and use transition hook allows you to update state without blocking the UI. So it's a new hook in React, and it will be useful if you want to use server actions outside of forms, buttons, and inputs. Okay, so let's say here I have that same add item actions defined in a separate file called _actions, and inside of my client-side component, I have a button. It's not inside of a form, and I don't want to use the form action. There is no form over here. I just have a button, and I want to invoke this add item server action in response to a click of the button. Then I can use the use transition hook, which gives me this start transition function back. To the start transition, you have to pass in a callback, which is going to be invoked. You can perform any asynchronous task that you want there, which is going to then perform that task without blocking the rendering of the UI, and then mutate your data on the server side. Now, one thing you may notice here is this revalidate path function that we're calling inside of our add item server action. And this is a way to manually purge the NextJS cache, the HTTP cache, and then refetch and re-render these specific server components at this specific path. For example, here we are just marking all of our product pages with this dynamic ID to be revalidated. We have the revalidate path and revalidate tag, both of which are just manual functions that you can use to purge NextJS cache to revalidate a specific path or a specific tag inside of your cache. And that was the third way to invoke your server actions to perform a data mutation or server mutation. Now, there's this section in the documentation that explains that if you're not doing server mutation, and that means you're not calling redirect, revalidate path, or revalidate tag after you have updated your data, because typically when you're updating the data, you would want to revalidate that path or the tag and refetch and re-render that specific segment to reflect that mutation. Now, if you're not doing that redirect or revalidation, you're not doing a server mutation. You're just performing a server action, and server actions are just functions that run on the server that you can call them from client side. If that's the case, you can actually pass your server action as a regular function down to your client components. So here inside of my page, there is this increment server action file created with this use server. It's a server action, and we're just passing it as a prop to our like button, which is a client-side component that just invokes that increment in response to an on click. So there's no form, there's no start transition, because we're not actually doing a server mutation, which means that we're not redirecting or revalidating a path after. We can just pass this server action functions as props down to client components and invoke them from the client side, for example, in response to an event. Now, progressive enhancement is, we touched on it briefly in the beginning. It all means that your forms are going to function without JavaScript. So if you're using server actions, as I mentioned, inside server components, it actually doesn't need any client-side JavaScript because server components don't actually ship any JavaScript to the client side. So your forms would work. Your users can submit data without any client-side JavaScript. And if you're using server actions inside client components, they would still work. So that your form would still be interactive. But once the action is invoked, it will be placed in a queue until the form is hydrated. So until React hydrates the form, and then that queued action will actually go ahead and execute. So in both cases, you're going to have interactive forms without the need of JavaScript. With the server components, you just have the added benefit of not actually needing any JavaScript. With the client components or using server actions inside client components, you can still have an interactive form without JavaScript, but the action or the execution will be queued until React actually had the chance to hydrate your forms. Now, the on-demand revalidation is using the revalidate path and revalidate tag from Nextcache, as I mentioned, to actually purge the cache for a specific path or for a specific tag inside of our cache in Next.js. Now validation, well, this data that you are sending to your server actions is data that's coming from the browser. It's coming from the client side, and you should never trust the data that's coming from the client side. It's basically the form data passed into your server actions. So you should verify, validate, and sanitize this data. You can use any type of validation that you want inside of your server actions or before you invoke your server actions. And there is a pattern shown inside the documentation whereby you would only call your server action if the data coming to your server action with the use of this with validate function actually passes your verification. So you sanitize it, you verify it, and only if it passes, then you would call the server action with it. Otherwise, you would just throw an error. Now we're going to talk about error handling, and I'm going to actually implement it when we jump to the code. But for now, we just know we have to validate the data coming in from the client side. Now you can also use cookies and headers inside your server actions. From the next headers, you can get the cookies. As you can see here, we are reading the cookies. And in the second function, we're actually setting the cookies. Pretty straightforward stuff. Other enhancements, I just grouped all the other hooks over here. There's this use optimistic hook that enables you to do optimistic UI or optimistic updates, which literally means that it would just immediately update the UI based on the desired action or the desired outcome of your server actions without having to wait for your server action to do that async update and then the response to come back. And there's also this use form status hook, which you can use it with your form actions, which is going to give you the pending property. So when your forms is actually submitting or the server action is in process, you'll get a pending status to maybe disable the form or the buttons to submit. This is again a client-side hook that you could use with form actions. I'm going to just quickly talk about this. Actions we mentioned, these are a React feature which allows you to do an asynchronous task in response to user events. That's React actions in short. Server functions are functions that run on the server, but you can call them from the client. Server actions are just server functions that are passed in as an action to a form. Now server mutations, as I touched on it, are server actions that mutate your data and then call redirect, revalidate path, or revalidate tag. Now let's jump into the code and see all this in action. So we're going to continue building on top of where we left off in the previous videos. For folks who haven't seen those videos or don't remember what we actually did, we created this Guestbook page where we were fetching some data from our backend. In this case was MongoDB. We are fetching the entries that people have left on our page, and then we were showing them down here. We also had this Guestbook entry form where we had this form with an input of a name and a message. And then the way we were handling this form submission was the traditional React way of handling form submission, whereby we have this handle submit attached to this on submit event handler on our form. We also created an API endpoint using route handlers in Next.js 13 or inside the app router. We had an API endpoint. This is the layer that actually talks to our database and then performs that insertion into our collection and then returns the data back or returns a success message or error message back over here. We also implemented this use transition hook because until the server actions are actually stable, you would get this start transition function from the use transition hook. And then up until this point, this is just regular React things. We're preventing the default behavior. We're getting the form data out of the event. Simple data validation here. We're going to replace this later on. We are having a local loading state to see if you're loading, which is when we're actually submitting this post request to our backend API. And then once we're done, if we don't have any errors, we're resetting the form, we're setting the loading to false, and we're using that start transition function we got back from this hook to actually refresh this specific route or the path. So therefore, we refetch the data and re-render the server component to actually then show the results of that newly created message. We actually discussed this specific page being a dynamic page by using this force dynamic. So therefore, we can see that message actually popping up at the end if we don't export this dynamic from this page. It will be by default a static page, which means the get data or the data fetching only runs at build time statically once, and it never actually updates the cache. So we needed to make this a dynamic page that actually refetches the data every time at request time. So therefore, inside of our form, when we are calling this router.refresh, it is actually refetching this data, which then includes that newly created message down there. We're actually getting this is pending from use transition, and creating this is mutating by looking at loading state and is pending that comes back from use transition. And if we are mutating, we're going to disable the form or maybe disable the button. Now let's see how we can update all of this to use server actions. First off, we no longer need that intermediary API layer to talk to our database. We can just define server actions that are functions that run on the backend, where we can just talk to our database, and we can call those server actions from our client side, in this case, from our form. So let's actually start by creating our first action. I'm going to go inside the app directory, create a new file called _actions. And inside of it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to export an async function called add entry that's going to receive some data and is going to do the following. It's going to get the name and the message. This is the form data submitted from our form in the client side. I'm going to call object from entries, and I'm going to pass this data, and we're going to do that same validation check. We're going to replace this with proper validation later on, but for now, if we don't have a name or we don't have a message, we're going to throw a new error to maybe say invalid input. And if we do have the name and the message, we're going to actually do the same thing we were doing inside of our API endpoint. So in this route.js that you can see, I created an API folder inside of the app and a guestbook endpoint. With this route.js, I'm creating an endpoint inside of it. Forget about this get. We're actually working with this post. You have to export named functions from this route handlers that are going to map to HTTP verbs. So for a post request, we are exporting a function named post. And here, what we were doing was to get the name and message out of the body. And once we had those things, we were going to call this create guestbook entry, which is a database function we created earlier, which just gets the name and message and gets a handle to our guestbook collection in MongoDB, and calls the insert one function on it and inserts a new document in our guestbook collection. So we're going to basically do the same thing that we are doing inside of our API route, but inside of our server actions. And that's why we no longer need the API endpoint to just handle the submission of this form. So I'm just going to copy this over to the server action. And here I'm just going to say, if I encounter any error, again, let's just throw a new error with that error. Now remember, the convention here is to actually include this use server directive up top. So if you are defining server actions, you have to either have this use directive inside the function body, or if you're defining all of your actions in a separate file, you can just put it once up top here, and then this would be applied to all the functions that you export from this file so that you can reuse these actions throughout your application. So let me save this and go back to our form over here. So what I'm going to do is that instead of on submit, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in an action, and here I'm going to just import that add entry we created inside of our actions. Let me just comment these things out. I'm going to also comment this imports out. We no longer need these hooks. And actually, I'm going to also comment the use client out. So I'm just dealing with a server component over here, as you can see, that uses this server action passed to the action prop of this form. Now we're going to get an error because we have to actually enable this experimental flag inside of our next config.js. So we have to pass in the experimental flag and server actions to true. I'm going to actually go ahead and restart the dev server. Now if I refresh the page, now I actually have another error. This is mutating that we were using before. So let me just X this out. And if I refresh the page now, we get our form back. Let's just review what we have done. We've created this action inside of a separate file with this use server up top. This is going to get the form data passed to it because we're passing this server action to the action prop of our form using React actions. The form data inside are going to be passed to this function. That's the form data that we're receiving here. I'm just creating an object from the entries inside of this form data, getting the name and the message out of it, and the name and the message are going to correspond to this name values you're putting on this input. So your inputs should have a name property or attribute. So I have an input with name of name and input with the name of message. These two are the same things I'm getting here. If I don't have name or message, I'm going to throw an error. And if I do have the name and message, I'm going to create a new entry inside my database. And if I encounter any error, again, I'm going to throw this error. Now let's actually go ahead and try and see if I can create a new message maybe here with server actions. So this encountered an error. Let's see what the error is. Now the create guestbook entry is not defined. Well, I copy pasted this, so let me just go ahead and actually import this over here. Let's just refresh the page, and if I go ahead again and create a message from server actions and add, nothing actually happened here. I clicked the add, nothing happened. Now if I pull up my MongoDB compass, you can see that this last message was actually created in our database, which means that the server action actually gone ahead and performed that data mutation in our backend, but we haven't revalidated the cache for this page. We haven't refetched the data to re-render the server component to see that actual last message we have over here. For this, we can use the functions I mentioned in the beginning, the revalidate path, which is going to revalidate this path. We're going to pass a string to the path that we want to be revalidated. These are manual functions from next cache that allows you to just manually purge the cache for this specific path. So therefore, as I did that, you could see this last message actually popped up over here. Now if I just refresh this page and create a new message, say with revalidate path, now you can see it just pops up at the end here, because now once this form action actually invokes this server mutation, we are actually revalidating this path at the end of it, which just reruns this server component, and this server component is this guestbook. As part of it, we're going to refetch this get data function to get our new entries, and then re-rendering this server component over here. Now, as you can see, this form actually doesn't wipe the content out, even though it re-renders this list down here. We can use a little trick here on our form without turning this into a client component. We're going to turn it into a client component, use a ref to reset the form later on when we are actually validating the data and handling the errors. But for now, you can just pass in a key, and then to this key, if you just pass in a random number, seems to be doing the trick over here by actually causing this form to be re-rendered when we are actually revalidating this path. So now if I go ahead and say with key prop, this is going to pop down here, and it's actually going to wipe the content of this file out. Now let's talk about error handling in our server mutation or server actions. Right now, all we're doing is to check to see if we have a name or a message submitted with our form. And if not, we're just throwing this error. So let me actually go ahead and create a new entry that doesn't have any message. So as you can see, this is actually throwing an error, which is caught by error boundary from our app. This is the error boundary that we created inside of our app, this error.js, as we discussed in the error boundary section. This is just capturing this error inside and then showing something went wrong from the app. Now let's actually go ahead and create an error boundary inside of our guestbook. So I'm going to create an error.jsx over here. Let me just copy some code so you don't have to watch me type over here. All I'm doing is to create a new error boundary inside of this guestbook segment, this route segment. So it's captured here instead of getting caught in the error boundary belonging to the app. And inside of it, I'm actually showing that same error message, but I'm using this reset function. If a function that the error boundary actually exposes, it's a way to actually reset the state inside of our error boundary, which allows the user to retry whatever it is that they were trying to do. If they were fetching a data, or in this case, submitting a form, it just allows them to do it again. So let's see this in action. If I now create that same entry without any message, now this time the error boundary from our inside of our guestbook is actually getting this, and if I try again or hit this button, it actually resets this path, resets the state inside of our error boundary, which allows me to just use this again. Now if you notice, we have this overlay of the error in the development. This is not going to be shown in production, as I can show you here. If I just open up my server and stop the dev server and actually run a build, and if I now start the production server by running pm start, actually opening up a new page, why not, and going to the guestbook, If I now create a message that doesn't create an entry that doesn't have a message, you can see that overlay no longer shows, because that's for development, for you as a developer to actually see what the error is. The users on the production bundle, or when you are actually deploying your app to production, won't see that overlay. But still, we were able to catch the error inside of our error boundary inside of this guestbook segment. And with this reset function that the error boundary exposes, we can just reset the form back. As you can see, we down here on the server, we can actually see the logs of the error still, but the user can just go ahead now. Maybe this time they actually provide a message, and if they add, everything works. So this error that we're throwing from our server actions, it's not actually crashing our whole application. And with this reset function, we can actually reset the form, allowing them to actually do something. Now, this error that we are currently throwing is not actually telling them any message that's useful. They don't know what went wrong, or if they had it to provide something else here. So let's actually look at implementing a more robust error handling. Going back to the action that we have over here, I'm going to actually verify or validate the data that the user is sending. Because at the end of the day, you have to remember, this is the data coming from the client side, from the browser, and should never trust any data coming in from the client from the browser. So you should validate this data. I'm going to use Zod, which is a data validation library that works well with TypeScript if you're creating your apps with TypeScript. Let me just make this a bit bigger. You can see for the installation, you can just install it. You can use it with JavaScript as well if you're using it with TypeScript, which it's where it actually shines, because it can infer the type of your types from your schemas instead of you having to duplicate creation of the schema and the type. But in this example, we're just using for the schema validation, we're not actually inferring any types from it. All you need to do is to install Zod. So let's just go ahead and stop the server and add Zod here. And what you need to do is, once you've installed it, you can just import Z from Zod. And with the use of this Z, you can define new schemas. For example, this my schema, which is a string, or we can define an object which has a username of string. We can include different limitations or verifications or validations to this string. And then once you have this schema created, you can parse any object against that schema to see if it actually passes your verification, or it's actually mapped to that same schema or the same shape that you have created for your schema over here. Down here, as I mentioned, you can use this infer from Zod to actually get the type or create a new type from this same schema you created up here. So you're not recreating these types over here. And it actually has this parse safe or safe parse method where it doesn't throw an error. The parse function throws an error if what you are trying to parse doesn't actually map to your schema. It throws an error. The safe parse doesn't throw an error, actually gives you an object back. It has a success or error property on it, which you can use and test and see what went wrong, or the messages, the specific error messages of why actually it failed the validation. Let's actually implement this in our code. I'm going to restart the dev server over here. I'm going to create a schema inside my lib folder. So I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call this schema.js. And all I'm going to do is to actually create some schemas. So let me just bring in here. I'm getting the Z from Zod. I'm creating a guest entry schema by calling the object function on the Z. I'm saying this entry should have a name, which is a string. It should be minimum of 1 character. And if they didn't pass this name, I'm including a specific error message that says name is required. And a message, I can do the same thing by passing in another object here and say message is going to be that message is required. Okay, let's now save this. Going back to our actions, we want to bring in that schema that we just created. I'm going to call the safe parse on it, and I'm going to pass in this name and message we got out of our form data to our safe parse function. Now, as you saw in the documentation, this is going to give me an error back if there is an error. So I'm going to call this an error. I'm going to rename this to actually Zod error because I have another error down here. And then I'm going to check and see if I have any error from actually validating our data. I'm going to actually return an object with the error property on it, and then I'm going to pass in this Zod error, and then I'm going to call the format function on this Zod error where it returns the error that you actually got. into an object where there is going to be keys mapping to the name of values you have actually defined inside of your schema. Now let's actually go back to our form and use these error messages that are coming from our server actions. So we have to turn this into a client component because we want to use a state to actually show these error messages to the client. So I'm going to comment this back in. Let me just also get rid of this sections that we no longer need, so it's nice and clean. So here, instead of passing this add entry directly to this form action, I'm going to actually create a client-side action. I'm just going to name this action, and this is going to receive the form data. And all we want to do here is just calling this add entry data, passing that same data. So I'm going to just get this action and pass it to the action prop here. I'm just going to also get rid of this key. We're going to reset the forms using a useRef because now we are a client component. Okay, let me just expand on this function a little bit more. If you remember in the beginning, we talked about this pattern of using client actions with server actions. This is a client action that we are creating because it does not have the use server directive inside the function body. It's just a client action, which is just an asynchronous function that will be invoked in response to user interactivity. This is using React actions. Now you can create and compose client actions with server actions. The difference is that server actions are functions that run on the server. You can call them from client, and client actions are functions that just run on the client in response to any user interactivity here. So we are passing this action to this action. And the reason why I'm doing this is that now that I'm calling this add entry from inside of my actions, this is actually possibly sometimes may return an error. So I'm going to have to read the response that comes back from this server action to actually check and see if I have any error on it. And if I do, I want to show some local error state so the user can get useful messages and understanding what went wrong. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to check to see if I have an error. And if so, maybe I want to set some local error state. So let me just define some state here. I'm going to use React user state hook to create some validation error state. I'm going to start off with null, and if we do get an error, what I'm going to do is to just set this validation error we created, and I'm going to pass this result.error to it. And if we don't have any errors, well, I'm going to just set this validation error back to null to wipe out any previously encountered error, and then we'd have to also reset the form. Now the proper way to reset the form here is to actually use the useRef hook. So I'm going to create a form ref by using the useRef hook from React. Let me actually also import that up top here. And I'm going to have to pass in this ref to my form element. So therefore down here, I can just come in here and say, okay, let's get a reference to our form and call the reset method on it. Let me just save this out. Actually, I do have a typo here, so it's form ref. Let's actually also initialize this to null. So now that we have this validation error, which is going to be an object coming from Zod that actually has keys mapping to the same schema that we have sent it. So it's going to have name and message on it. I'm going to create this error messages down here. So I'm going to check to see if the validation error actually exists and if the name property on it exists. And if so, I'm going to just render a p tag over here that actually shows the error message that we got here. So by calling validation error, we're going to access the name on it. There is going to be an underscore errors property, which is going to be an array. So I'm going to have to call the join method on it. I'm going to join them with a comma so we can show all the error messages. Let me actually also pass in a class here. I'm going to say text small and text red 400. Let me save this up. And with the same logic, let me actually also go ahead and add some error messages to our input message. And the only thing different here is that we're checking the message property on our validation error object. If the message field has any error on it, we're going to show that specific error messages down here. And now if I go back to our application, now if I go ahead and create a new entry without a message, we should be able to get a specific message back inside of our client component this time that allows us to hold some local state. If I now go ahead and actually do create a message message over here, submits that message down here, and then resets the form back to the initial state. And similarly, if I provide a message without a name, I'm going to see that specific message that we passed in or provided inside of our schema to Zod is going to show up there. And then once I provide my name, that actually is going to also go ahead and the message is going to be created. That's a wrap for this lesson, folks. We talked about server actions, which is a new way to do server mutations. It reduces the amount of JavaScript you need to send to the client side. It actually works without any JavaScript on the client side if you're using it primarily inside server components. And even if you're using it with client components, your form is still interactive, but that action is going to be queued until React actually hydrates that component and then performs that action. Now, this also eliminates the need to have an intermediary API layer. Traditionally in React, when we wanted to handle form submissions, we would create an API layer. Your form would submit the data to that API layer. The API would then talk to your database and then respond back to your client side. With the use of server actions, you can just perform that same operation directly with exposing a function that runs on the server, but you can call it on the client in response to user interactions. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments. If you're interested in learning Next.js, this was an actual lesson from my course. There's a link in the description. The course will launch this week. Check it out. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.